Hello, and welcome to this Bournbrook interview. I'm ST Wickett, and I'm joined by Connor Lynch, an architect who has designed a proposal for the Prince Philip statue. Connor, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much.
So, I suppose we should start with the obvious and get a sort of abridged version of your proposal for the Prince Philip statue. Where did the idea come from? What sort of things do you take inspiration from, and that sort of thing?
Well, the idea for this particular statue came from, in fact, a tweet I saw from, I think it was City AM, which said MPs back a statue proposal, the idea of a statue going ahead. So, over the space of 2 days, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, evening, and the following Monday, that I drew a pencil drawing. It's all pencil, in fact, of Prince Philip on a plinth. And it was based on, I didn't go through a design phase, I just went with my first iteration. And it's based on the statue of King George the Sixth and the Queen Elizabeth Memorial, which is on the mall. And that, well, the original was unveiled by Queen Elizabeth in 1955, and the Queen Mother statue was added, I think, in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. But those statues bear the royal coat of arms on the plinth, and they're at the bottom of Pall Mall. Fantastic location, and I don't think a statue is going to be added to that arrangement, but this Prince Philip statue is based on that configuration. And if you look at the drawing, which I have here, we'll see that it's a very basic plinth. It's tall. The character of the architecture is meant to match the character of the man as well. So it's tall, it's robust in the sense that it's crisp lines, there's not many curves, and it's a Tuscan cornice. And of the orders, as you Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Tuscan would be suited to, I think, if I was designing, say, a military barracks or a Royal Navy base, the Tuscan order would be suited to that. So I thought it would be suited to a plinth for Prince Philip. And on the plinth, there is a relief of his coat of arms, which is, of course, particular to him. And he is stud wearing his coronation robes and the Royal Navy court dress. When I did tweet it out, a lot of people said he should be wearing his naval uniform, which I agree. The Royal Navy was such an important part of His Royal Highness, and for that reason, he's in Royal Navy court dress, but he was also a key figure of the royal family, and so the coronation robes are a part of that. So in a way, the combination between robes and Royal Navy court dress, I thought, was sort of struck the mark. And
Yeah, and the it was a really beautiful beginning of his life of service to the Windsor family, as he, at the coronation he swore allegiance to the Queen, essentially. But so
yes,
yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that it possibly wouldn't be on the Mall. Where would you like to see it?
I haven't really thought about that. I suppose you'd have to look at Crown property or a suitable location for it. The reason I did it so quickly was that traditional proposals tend to be counter proposals. They always tend to come after money has been spent, and there's some awful new block going up somewhere that looks as though it's landed from outer space, and a traditional architect, well, myself included in the past, will just make a counter proposal at that point. And yes, that goes down very well on social media, and it gets loads of retweets, and it goes all over Instagram and all that sort of thing, and people agree with it. They say, why can't we build something like this instead? But The horse sort of bolted. You're not going to, nothing's going to change with that particular project. So with the statue of Prince Philip, I decided as soon as I saw that there was any sort of proposal that a statue might go ahead and MPs were backing it publicly, I thought, make a classical proposal first, get it out there, and it really did. It got around Twitter at least. Yeah, I did send it to some newspapers like the Telegraph and the Daily Mail and such, but they didn't get back to me.
So it's going on in Bournbrook.
Yes.
So yeah. The see, obviously, because I'm not involved in architecture. That sounds quite odd to me. That the the royal family wouldn't consider a classical style for memorials of Philip.
I would imagine so. Given the precedent of the Queen Mother statue in 2009, I would imagine that this would be classical. Yeah.
Also, talking about quick sidetrack, talking about counter proposals. You also did a proposal for a station in Birmingham.
Yes.
Which, I mean, the planned station is horrid. But what did you, when you saw that? What did you look at, and what did you want to fix, and how do you think you've proposed that properly?
So that particular project, the Perry Bar outside Birmingham, I saw it on Twitter. I think I was working late in the office that evening, and I saw this. I was flicking through Twitter, and I saw this awful glass box with some sort of rusted metal top to it, and it was tweeted out by, I may be mistaken, but was it a councillor or an MP? It was someone in that role, and he was getting a lot of flack, and the tweet was being ratioed. And I decided, just on a piece of paper I had beside me, I did a quick sketch of just the most basic railway station that would look a lot better. And it was broken pediments with finials on the summit of the pediment. The pediment is the triangular piece, like a gable end. And I had shallow arches either side with windows set into those. And in the center, I had Doric order, which is very stripped, very basic, with baseless columns. So the columns had capital, but they just sat on the ground. There was no moldings on the base. And that formed just an elegant, simple, and somewhat budget design. Because I based it off the fact that they were building a glass box. This wasn't something that they're going to spend a lot of money on. And so it was basic, classical, but good materials, stand the test of time and all that. And anyway, that tweet gained some traction and people liked it. So later on that evening, I made another drawing. I took more care. I think I spent about maybe 25, half an hour on it, 25 minutes, which I tweeted out. And then I got in touch with Bournbrook and submitted it to Bournbrook with a paragraph. But yeah, that's an example of a project that will go ahead. The counter proposal was fun and it was nice, and it was a bit of sparring and all that, but it's not going to change anything for Perry Bar. I think they're going to get their glass box.
Why is it that there's such a proliferation of modernist structures which feel quite rootless and transient, and they could be anywhere in the world? Is it just a taste thing, and you and I are on the outside of that sort of taste regime, or is it just a financial choice? Like, what do you think is fueling the proliferation of these buildings?
it's a good question. It's any manner of things, in the sense that modernism, when it started, was the international style. It is an international way of looking at buildings, and there's no building that's going to be built in this particular location, or it's of this place. It's international. But I do think then, as you say, cost plays a big role. And yeah, it's there's so many things at play. I have found that people of all political persuasions like traditional architecture, and your pitched roof with a tile or a slate roof, and symmetrical front with maybe sash windows and nice brickwork, and whether it's a traditional high Tory, or your Marxist professor or something like that, they both like that building. And I have found that across the political spectrum, there is a favor towards traditional architecture. I don't think classical architecture belongs to a certain political persuasion. Yes, in the past, and as the past in the future, political parties and movements and all sorts of things like that do take certain styles, and they make that their own. It's part of their ideology as such. But traditional architecture as such is not married to any particular ideology. Classical, for example, really just means the highest standard, the best standard. And I would say that a lot of modern architecture rests on novelty. So when they produce a building, it's a new museum or a library, such as the one in Birmingham. They base it on its novelty. It looks flashy for its opening debut, and it makes the front cover of architectural magazines. But novelty, like jokes, get old. They wear off, and everyone knows the trick, and then they really quickly become dated. Now that's visual, so that's aesthetically they become dated, but physically they also become dated, because these buildings are of synthetic materials, and synthetic materials don't hold up well against weather over the years, and they would never last a century. They just, within 35 years, key junctions and just areas to keep out the weather, keep out the elements, will fail, and the mounting cost of maintenance will mean that down the line they'll say, let's pull this building down. Whereas with a traditional building, so no building is going to stand the test of time forever. Brick or synthetic, whatever it is, will be degraded by the weather. But synthetic materials, their junctions, where they're put together, they just fail. They're not strong. They don't stand the test of time. But with traditional materials, I would say that not only do they stand the test of time, but these buildings aesthetically are sustainable, because people from successive generations look at them and say, this is worth keeping. This is worth looking after. And they say that not only because it's beautiful, but because human effort has been put into it. And a very simple example of this, I could say, is a Georgian railing. Think of a Georgian railing outside a house, and it's on a street front, but it's got lovely decoration at the base and where the railing meets the cross rail, and maybe it's got finials on top of each railing. Because that is handcrafted, well, at least the original was molded, but there's something nice to it. It's an original design. It's got some flair to it, some flowers, leaves, or something like that. The owner will look at that railing and will wire brush it and have it maintained, and successive generations will do the same. Whereas if you had a plain railing, as is the norm nowadays, as soon as that becomes rusty, or it becomes in disrepair, it's far easier to just say remove it and replace it. So
yeah, and buildings built to a classical style also feel more cohesive. The streets they're in feel more unified, whereas if you're in, say, Bishopsgate in London, where you have like the Gherkin and that sort of thing, the buildings feel like, and yeah, this may be my ignorance coming through, but they feel like it's erected for not only as you said, like novelty value, but also the vanity of the architect. Because I said they get into the magazines and they have attention for however long, but the building that they create is it stands on its own, and the buildings in the area all kind of clash because they're
you are absolutely right. Stands on its own, and about the architect is exactly it. All these buildings shout me, me, me. They're all fighting for attention, and none of them sit comfortably together. Now, I would say the Gherkin, as an example, because its shape and its form, that it's actually one of the buildings that has been successful in the sense that people in London, I believe, it's one of the buildings that people do like. Its dome shape. There isn't a Gherkin in New York. There isn't a Gherkin in Taipei or Hong Kong. It's not a simple cylinder rising into the sky full of glass. So for that reason, I wouldn't choose that as an example. But I would say that for a lot of modern architecture, particularly the star-chitects, as they're called, the star architects, it is a me because their style is married to them. Only they can properly understand their style as such, and therefore, in terms of comparison, they can only compare with their other buildings. They're in the ring with themselves, whereas when you're in the classical tradition, when you're designing traditional architecture, you are in the ring with all the greats of the past. That's who you're competing against, and that's who your buildings will be held up against as a comparison. Have you met this standard? Are you standing in this hall of these great masters? Whereas these me buildings, they stand on their own in isolation, and when they stand next to each other, it's competition. It's look at me, no look at me, not a think of Bath or think of I'm trying to think of just a high street, that like Winchester High Street. You have many buildings from different centuries, yet they all sit comfortably together because they all share a lot of harmonious elements. And these were not the works of architects, but the works of builders over many generations. There's great wisdom in that. And they sit well together because they're focused on the vertical, so that the windows are upright. All these simple things, but the materials tend to be the same. If it's in a particular county, they'll have materials that are specific to that region, or maybe for that local area. A cottage in Cornwall will be different to a cottage in Scotland, and in between all that, there will be many different regional and local variations. And I think that adds to the interest of places and life.
Is that the difference between, as you mentioned, a star-chitect and someone like Christopher Wren, who is the difference between them a deference to the tradition?
I would say that, Christopher Wren was in the ring with the masters who preceded him, and it wasn't his style. There are certain things he did that you could accuse, that you could say, oh, I think that's a Wren building. But it can't stand in comparison to what preceded it, and as a tradition, what came after it. And Yeah.
You mentioned the Queen Mother, who the central square in Poundbury is named after. To anyone who's listening and doesn't know what it is, in the quickest of terms, what is Poundbury and what does it represent in British urban planning?
Yes, Poundbury is well, it's the result of His Royal Highness Prince of Wales. Um, he produced a book which described his urban design principles, and it was published, I think, in 1988, and that was called A Vision of Britain. And I would recommend anyone to find and read that, get a copy. It's a fantastic book. But Poundbury commenced in the early 90s, I think it was 93, and the final uh, part of it will be completed by 2025. Um, and it's an urban extension of Dorchester in Dorset. It's on Duchy of Cornwall land, and its master plan was designed by Leon Creer, who was from Luxembourg, I believe. It's designed with people in mind rather than cars. So it's walkable, it's mixed use. The idea is that you can live, work, play within the same place, and therefore build community, get to know people. It's not deserted in the morning and people flooded in the evening. You're not dependent on your car in that way. There are arterial routes through it, which are straight roads into Queen Mother Square, into the centre, which allow cars to go freely. But the rest of the roads are, they can narrow and they can bend and wind, and it's not conducive to driving around in a car. It's quite awkward, in fact, and it forces you to walk rather than drive, and that makes it very safe for the pedestrian. So people walk everywhere there, and very safe for families.
It's
Uh,
cleaner too.
and it's cleaner.
Yeah.
Yes, well, it is. It is clean. It's very tidy, and there are covenants as well. So when you there are covenants. So when you buy into Poundbury, you know that there are certain things you can't do to change the appearance of your house and things like that. Uh, Simple things like parking. People don't park in front of their houses. There are a few places, of course, you can do that, but there is allowance for cars to park behind houses in landscaped blocks. And this is what was done in Georgian times and Victorian times, when the mews, the carriage house, was behind the house. And that happens in Poundbury. Um, it started off in the 90s with various architects, phase one. It drew the ire of a lot of the architectural press, but I think they've warmed to it because it's shown to be successful. Um, as the phases have carried on into phase two and three, it's been less architects. So um, Ben Pentreath, George Sanders Smith, to name a few, were involved in phase two, and then primarily phase three. And phase three, of course, I think phase four will be the final phase. But yes, Poundbury is traditional architecture, and traditional materials built to stand the test of time. It's very popular because it's beautiful to look at, and uh, Queen Mother Square is in the center, and there's a Quinn and Terry building there, Francis Terry building, Ben Pentreath, and yeah, I'd recommend anyone to visit.
Because yeah, it's a lovely part of the country as well. Poundbury was the trailblazer in this sense, and there's more developments coming through. Some further along than others. We mentioned briefly before we recorded Fawley Waterside as well.
Yes,
Um,
yes. That used to be a power station, I believe.
Yes, yeah, it's a disused. It's in Hampshire, isn't it?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's
Um,
Ben Truth. That's
hmm. They all are they all on the south coast, or are there vague plans to sort of do similar things?
no. There are many. There are others. There is. I think it's called Tornagrain, which is being built by the Earl of Moray in Scotland. There's also Knockroon, which was started in Scotland as well. Um, and there's Nansladen, which is in Cornwall, which is also has all these have learned from Poundbury, what to do, what not to do, and Nansladen has taken all that knowledge and is greatly successful, and it's so successful, in fact, that the government are recognizing it as best practice, and that's in Cornwall. Um, there are some developer knockoffs that you see scattered about that people who would maybe want to detract from Poundbury would say that this is a copy of Poundbury, and of course they're copying it in the sense that they want to sort of lean in that direction, but they might only have 2 or 3 house types, and they don't have the urban design that Poundbury does. It's not quite getting there, but I do think that architecture is going in the right direction. I think
That's good to hear.
yeah,
That's really good to hear.
there are more young traditional architects. Um, compared to 10 years ago, there's a lot more, and also it has that added allure of being sort of rebellious. It's against the mainstream somewhat, to an extent, and that has an appeal, I imagine. But yes, things are looking up.
Well, before I was saying that that sounded like an inverted version of the Fountainhead. Without revealing too much, what is your own story with architecture? Was there like a moment of inception where you sort of fell in love with it, or has it always been something that you were drawn towards?
I've I've been drawing since I can remember. Since I was a toddler, I've been drawing, and I didn't watch TV growing up. For entertainment, I would draw. So it's always been something I've been doing. And then the idea of drawing something that then becomes physically manifest, just it seems like it's still, to this day, it still seems like magic, as far as I'm concerned, that an idea I start doodling on a piece of paper and then draw properly and then put measurements and everything else becomes a home, a place. You've there is somewhere now that has that manifest in reality, and I think that is there's a magic to that. But
And as you said earlier, the classical style has more permanence. So you're almost giving something that's gonna outlive you.
yes, well, I suppose the thing about classical architecture is a lot of the buildings that we admire, that is classical architecture and traditional architecture, was built centuries before we existed, and yet here we are greatly admiring them. And I don't see why in 3 centuries' time our counterparts won't look at classical buildings we create in the tradition and have the same thoughts. And that's why I think classical architecture is forever young. It's human. It's based on our most. Its foundation point is our most primitive form of construction, creating a shelter, creating a place to live, reside, settle, and it's grown from that. And classical architecture visually contains all the necessary lessons of how to build. It doesn't need to be written down, because although it's in stone, the language of timber construction is there. The rafters, the projecting cornice to protect from weather, the casting of shadows. But for me personally, going into classical architecture, when I went to uni in first year, I accepted what my lecturers said. They said, classical architecture, traditional architecture, that's all of the past. We haven't done that in 100 years, and we're never going to do it again. It's irrelevant, it's invalid. And they'd use the word pastiche. That term you'll hear a lot in architectural circles to describe Poundbury, and pastiche is just an imitation. But I discovered Quinlan Terry. We had a history exercise in semester 2, and I read about Quinlan Terry in one paragraph. It had a photograph of Richmond Riverside, which he designed in 1985. And from that photograph, it said in the caption, "Design 1985," and I couldn't believe that this all these buildings, beautifully designed, was built so recently. And it began the dismantling of what my lecturers were saying in terms of we don't do this anymore. And I dug a bit deeper, and I found Quinlan Terry's website, and then I found various other traditional architects. And from there, I said, we are still doing this. Yes, it is on the periphery. It tends to be just country houses, which is fantastic. I love working on country houses. It's a great privilege. But it's not, we don't see classical buildings popping up in our cities anymore. And from second year, I designed a classical building, and it got completely destroyed in the grading and the judging by the lecturers. And uni was a tough battle in that regard. I did sometimes do a semester a modernist design, and then I do traditional design for the second semester. And needless to say, my modernist design, I do less work and get a better grade. And in my traditional design, I do 3 times as much work and scrape a pass. But having finished uni and all that, the only work I've kept was my traditional designs, the ones that got poor grades. But that was to dissuade me from doing it. Yes, but I'm glad to say that I'm on the other side, and I've finished with uni and all that, and I'm working with classical architecture and bringing about new buildings in traditional style, which people will love to live in, look at, and be proud of, and maintain. And it's no wonder that what we call unspoiled places cost a fortune to live in, because the demand is so high and supply for those places is so low. And I just want to, in my career, create more beautiful places and essentially increase that supply. And let's do away with this last half century of rather appalling, soulless, mainly concrete and synthetic places. Now that's going to take a while, but I am happy to say that I think it is going in the right direction, and things are looking up. And I think in this country, it is a large part to do with His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Without him, I honestly don't think traditional architecture would be where it is. And a lot of people in this country now live, like Poundbury, they live in places that are based on the best standards of the past, with all the conveniences and comforts that you'd expect of a modern house, but the beauty that we love of traditional architecture. People live like that because of his efforts. That has made him no ally of the greater architectural world, but I think he's the ally of most of the country, outside of the architectural realm when it comes to buildings and houses.
There were two names that I was thinking of going into this interview. The first being His Royal Highness Prince Charles, and the second being Scruton, who a lot of my sort of layman's love of architecture has come from reading Scruton and reading his works on beauty. To what extent was he an influence on you as a way of thinking?
Scruton was a great influence because he enunciated, gave words to the, for want of a better word, the feelings I had towards particular buildings, or my comparison between an ugly building and a beautiful building, that he would enunciate it very, very eloquently. Scruton did say that ugliness means buildings that are unadaptable, unhealthy, and unsightly, and which violate the context in which they are placed. That such buildings destroy the sense of place, and they undermine the spirit of community and ensure that we're not at home in our world. And he came from Reading, where the streets, the homely Victorian streets of his city were replaced by modernist blocks, and where there was once not only a color and stone and brick, but there was craftsmanship and life and a character that was of Reading, that was built over generations, that it was cleared for something that could have been anywhere in the world, but not only anywhere in the world, but somewhere that is grey, dismal, colorless, characterless, completely uprooted. And yes, I think Scruton just nailed it.
Connor, thank you very much, man. It's been very, very insightful. And I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. And I don't know when I subscribed, but I've been reading the Bournbrook now for a good while. And I listen to the podcast when I can on the weekend. Yeah, so keep up the great work. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. Cheers.
See you.